나무 묘호랭개교 나무 묘호랭개교 나무 묘호랭개교. All right, then. Let's continue with the MulaMadhyamakaKarika of Nagarjuna. We left off with the verse, an action does not possess conditions, nor is it devoid of conditions. Conditions are not devoid of an action, neither are they provided with an action. All right. Pick an action. I'll say speaking. Man, my glasses karma. Something. Anyway. What conditions are required to speak? Oh my goodness. We could speak for at least an hour on those. Why do I say this? Because, well, just think. The movement of air is required to speak. Oh, wow, the movement of air. So there has to be air. What is air? Air, everything that is at the same time is not something else, right? It's like the cup half full or half empty. What's a cup? What defines a vessel? Is it the border between what is outside of it and what is inside of it? And when that vessel is half full, is it half full, half empty? Is it a displacement? There's all sorts of, you can go down rabbit holes here, right? Like with my glasses. And then, okay, air. All right, I get what you mean, Sifu. So, but what about vocal cords? What had to come about in order for vocal cords, writ large, in other words, not my vocal cords, but vocal cords, that combination of thingifying, how did that come about? Because all of those things need to come together. Each have tendencies, and each exists within their existence conditions. So speaking and action may require all of these other conditions, in fact, tendencies and conditions, but conditions. There has to be the right amount of air, the right temperature range of air, the lungs pushing through. You get it. You could even get ridiculous about this. If I'm standing in the middle of a forest and speaking and nobody hears it, am I speaking? Now we get into the meanings of words and it gets crazy. But one thing's certain. The action of speaking does not own the conditions. The conditions don't suddenly materialize as the act of speaking occurs. An action does not possess conditions. walking does not own feet, legs, the surface being traversed, even down to the fact that the legs are just moving and perhaps the earth is simply moving underneath the legs. Whatever. All the arguments and silliness and minutia that you could get into, the action doesn't manifest the conditions. It doesn't possess them. Really obvious statement, right? Nor is it devoid of conditions. Oh, right, because some conditions do manifest as a result of speaking, like the pressure waves in that air that make a sound instantiate in your eardrum. It's just the movement of air shaking your ear, and your brain takes that shaking and makes something out of it. All of that is irrelevant, except to the action. So it's not devoid of conditions. It just doesn't possess conditions. It manifests some conditions, but it's not a particular word that makes these particular waves occur, and you're receiving of those particular waves and frequencies and pressures of air. All those conditions, they're not part of the language or the act of my thinking and moving my mouth and vibrating chords in my throat. They all have conditions and operate within conditions, but they're not possessed either way. So it doesn't possess conditions, and it's not devoid of conditions because it doesn't manifest without conditions. So you see how these are statements that are very shortcut to larger conceptual thinking. The second part then says conditions are not devoid of action, neither are they provided with action. So looking back the other way, the conditions for you to hear sound and relating it to a mouth and vocal cords creating those sounds, all of those myriad mental conditions, environmental conditions, organ consciousness conditions, all of that, the conditions are there, but they're only instantiated during an act. An act obviates that they exist, and that act may instantiate conditions within those conditions. But no condition exists without being experienced. There's a condition right now in square or cubic inch of the glacier that is the main part of Western Antarctica. And we could give it a longitude and a latitude and a depth and blah, blah, blah. But unless we're doing that, we aren't experiencing it. And so that condition, it really, to our acknowledgement, doesn't exist until we discover or label or, right? So the action of it is there awaiting being enlivened by a consciousness. So the conditions are not devoid of an action. Something froze that water, air, on and on and on, the creation of the universe. That you can go ad nauseum to provide a proof of existence of that particular cubic centimeter of ice in that glacier in Antarctica. It didn't just appear. The condition wasn't in space. The tendency for it to manifest is long-winded of different actions and conditions that needed to exist for that condition to exist. So conditions are not devoid of action. Neither are they provided with an action, because now it's just what we would say dormant. It's not, you could say it stays frozen, but is that an action? It's really more a condition. And because the conditions around it are such that it stays in its condition, then its tendency is not to change. Conditions. So you see, this is circular, but it does define something quite granular. And you'll find that as you read Nagarjuna, or the Karikas, this is how they're constructed. This action is supposed to be the causal activity that makes the cause and conditions produce the right kind of effect. If it is supposed to explain why only when a seed is planted in warm, moist soil does a sprout appear, and why a sprout doesn't arise from a stone. Yeah, we get that, right? So, lest I be simply an audiobook for these authors, I'm not going to read everything they write, because I think, as I said in the last video, it's important to understand the meaning of a karika, such as Nagarjuna's, in our own way, to come to our own ahas. So I've read quite a bit so far, but from this point on, unless I see a reason to, I'm going to focus on the verses themselves, because I think that's where the meaning lies, just as Shakyamuni warns us all the time. Words are tools to help point at the moon, but the moon is the objective, not the words. So let's try to discover the moon for ourselves in these verses, okay? Next verse. They are said to be conditions when something arises dependent on them. We were talking about that just a moment ago. When something has not arisen, why then are there not non-conditions? So this is circling back to the idea that if I speak, does the environment in which, the conditions in which I speak, if I'm not speaking, do all of those conditions disappear? Well, again, we could argue about that, because as we explored in the last verse, when I speak, new conditions are introduced into conditions. So is the fact that I'm not speaking, not introducing new conditions into the conditions, indicate a non-condition? See, that would be to say that something exists permanently, and I only lend a hand to its instantiation with the act of speaking. That would be a misunderstanding of impermanence, would it not? So I think that's what we're touching on here. Something cannot be called a condition whether the object, that is, the supposed effect, is not yet existent or already exists. So conditions, tendencies and conditions, they don't change based on actions. We've already talked about that too. If non-existent, what is the condition of? And if existent, what is the point of the condition? So, as we know from Nagarjuna, what he's eventually going to lead us to is the idea that all of these tendencies and conditions are conditional, and that whether an act instantiates in conditions, introducing new conditions ad nauseum, because it's not just the conditions of speak, it's conditions of self, of expression, of being. So he's going down to the granularity, and he's saying, if these things manifest as we're doing them, and there isn't a contradiction to them when we're not doing, then does any of it exist, is of its own nature, is created in and of itself? So we're heading toward sunyata here, that it isn't just your idea of self that is an illusion of being, which provides us with many apparatus to observe this process. But ultimately, this apparatus is not just this apparatus, it's this apparatus, it's this apparatus, it's this building apparatus, this video, this microphone, this robe, the hills, the trees, it's all the same apparatus of experience. Ultimately, all of this is a temporary instantiation, a manifestation, a personal drama to be experienced as an impermanent little spark to afford understanding and meaning of its grandeur and its non-grandeur. It's a temporary thing. Even the universe, billions of years old, that, again, I keep coming to this problem of time in Buddhism. You see that all of this is a construct. It is a constructed existence, but it is a moment to moment. Sometimes it helps to think of, we think I'm sitting here solidly on this stool, on this frame, on this earth, in this building, on concrete. We think concretely. We thingify everything. But then consider that the earth is rotating at some 300 kilometers per second, rotating and circling around the sun at some 300,000 kilometers per, I don't even know the numbers. I keep forgetting them. The bottom line is that we are moving on this earth. The earth is spinning. It is spinning on a trajectory through time around a sun which itself is flying around an arm of a galaxy which is spinning at thousands and thousands of kilometers per second, which itself is moving through the universe at some ridiculous speed. When you really, really think about that, consider that, it's quite impossible to imagine anything stationary. Right? This is Einstein, relativity. If you're standing in an aircraft, a commercial jet that's going 730 miles an hour through the air, let alone the planet rotation and this blah, 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 just you and the plane, and you go to the back of the plane and you run toward the captain's cabin, how fast are you going? Well, to you, You're going maybe 5 miles an hour or 10 miles an hour, or however. I don't know how fast you can run. It doesn't matter. The point is, your speed is relative to your environment, your place of reference. But to anyone on the ground watching you, you're going 730 miles per hour plus your 10 mile per hour speed. You're running faster than the plane. Point being is that you would never, when we, and it's in our language, when we point up at the sky and go, look, a plane, where? There. All of that, it's wrong. What we see is an arc of a plane moving, because nowhere where we point is that plane still there, right? Everything we experience is like this. Even our own bodies. Every atom, electron, proton, matter, thingness. It's a moving target. Nothing is stationary. Nothing exists. Everything is in a process of being. Birth, death, birth, death, birth, death, birth, death, birth, death, birth, death. Moment, 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 moment. I go back to my old example. Geometry. What's a line? Oh, a line is a series of discrete points. Okay, what's a point? It's a dot. No, it's not. A point is a location. There's nothing there. A point is a location in space-time. And the line is time, space-time. It's an invention. To use your Buddha mind is to free yourself of that invention and observe the occurrence of space-time, of things point to point to point to point to point, with your own point to point to point, point, point. Birth, death, birth, death, birth, death. That's the cycle that Buddhism talks about constantly. Being anchored to that cycle is where all suffering manifests, because it's wrong. It's an illusion. Become the observer. Get out of the rapids. So this is what he's digging into and defining terms. We tend to read each statement and each verse like it's a complete thought. But Nagarjuna is digging into the nature of thought. And he's starting to build a vocabulary of understanding the temporal, ephemeral nature of existence. To really pound into the students of Buddhism who are just grasping about letting go of the illusion of them, their ego, their self, their being, and telling them, you haven't gone far enough. You haven't finished. There is more to let go of. These two verses explain in greater detail the argument of verse 4. The supposed conditions for the arising of a visual cognition, functioning eyes, presence of an object, light, and so on, cannot be said to be conditions at the time when the visual cognition does not yet exist, since they have not yet performed the productive activity required to make them what they are properly called conditions. If a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, has the tree made a noise? Certainly by inference and logic we can say it did, it just was no one heard it. That's true. So that's what this argument is circling about. Can we say there are conditions for speech everywhere in the universe? We can't prove that. Nor can we experience it. For one thing, because we're bound quite severely to this earth. Moving on. The pattern of argumentation, which we might call the argument of the 3 times, will figure prominently in Chapter 2. The point of the argument, as applied to the present case of origination, is that for those who hold that cause and effect are distinct proponents of the view known as Asadkaryavada, the producing relation can only be conceptual construction. So that's what we've been talking about, right? 7th verse. Since a dharma does not operate whether existent, non-existent, or both existent and non-existent, how is it that how in that case can something be called an operative cause? So if nothing exists until it occurs, experienced occurs, then how can it be said that something brought it about? A dharma being existent is said to indeed be without objective support. Then why, again, posit an objective support in the case of a dharma without an objective support? The object of a mental state, such as a visual cognition, he's using visual, I used oral, is said to be the objective support of that cognition. To call this a kind of condition is to say that the cognition cannot arise without its object. The argument against there being such a condition is once again like the verses 6 through 7. At that time, when a cognition exists, its supposed objective support cannot be said to produce it. Right. So if I take an action of speaking, and that creates several conditions, air, movement, sound, blah, 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 we can't say that it is air, movement, sound that caused me to speak. Kind of obvious again, right? The action creates the conditions that are available in order to manifest the conditions of action also have the potential action, even if it's stasis, to be there in order for me to take action and create new conditions within those conditions. We get all of that. This is just argumentation about making sure we understand that things don't just appear and happen. There's conscious activity, and that's an arc of time. It's constantly occurring. Otherwise, every letter and sound I could make would come out all at once. And it would, I just said the whole book. No, it's not how thingness in this samsaric environment of space-time is constructed. It doesn't work that way. Everything is constructed. Words are constructed. Sounds are constructed. Actions within those constructions have their own constructions. We can't say that because constructions exist, people are talking somewhere in Bolivia right now, it doesn't make my speech occur. There's a whole different set of karma at work here in order for this to occur and for you to hear it. I mean, these may seem obvious, but Nagarjuna is nailing down a particular kind of granularity so that when he then says his postulation, what he's argumenting about, it becomes irrefutable, lest you sweep away all of this obviousness. In other words, he's going to demonstrate magical thinking. You can't say that. If you know all these things, then you have to look at yourself as a fool, because what you're saying isn't based on anything real. It's just an opinion, poorly constructed. So he's going to make sure he constructs his opinion to the most minute detail. Right? Interesting. Next verse. Deconstruction does not hold when dharmas have not yet originated. Again, dharma, and I've talked about this before, a lot of people interchange that word with teaching, and that's not correct. Dharma has a much broader sense about it. You could. I'm going to dance around words now. Dharma is kind of like an invention of knowing, an experience of knowing. All of that depends on so many other things, but dharma is a word, and it captures not only the experience of knowing, but the knowing of the experience of knowing. It's a tendency and condition reckoning, if you will. And that may show up in the form of a teaching, but that teaching is not the Dharma. The Dharma is the auspices of the teaching. And if there is no activity in which to gain knowledge of experience, then there is no Dharma. Over and over again, this negation of what we try to instantiate as something is proven by Nagarjuna to simply not be there. So the thingness of things ends up being empty, because the thingness of things is a momentary perceptive device made of tendencies and conditions within tendencies and conditions, which operate within the tendencies and conditions that you're manifesting at the moment of experience. That's when the Dharma happens. You don't turn a corner and bump into it. Therefore, all dharmas are empty. Why are they empty? Because empty means nothing's bumping into them. Nothing's instantiating them. There is no experience happening, being, time, moment. Everything is empty. That doesn't mean you can't dance on the waves. It doesn't mean you can't surf the ocean. It just means enjoy the dance. Stop being connected to permanence. I can't play tennis unless I have the right togs and the right racket and the right shoes. And oh my God, we need a clay court because that's a whole different thing. That is not tennis. Tennis is your experience of acceleration and chasing down that little ball in space and sending it the other direction to see if you can challenge your opponent and find their skill and your skill in this dance of tennis. You don't even need a racket or a ball or a court. You could do that in many other ways. Everything, the whole construction of tennis is an invention. We didn't walk the planet one day, shoot all the dinosaurs and said, look, let's play tennis. And a tennis court went, it sounds ridiculous, I know. But understand that this is how many people think. They don't literally think those ridiculous thoughts, but it's just as ridiculous to think that there's a soul, that there is permanence, that there's destiny, that there's I'm a this or I'm a that. The entire human samsaric experience is locked into this illusion that everything is real. I'm not saying it is non-real. I'm saying the issue of real or non-real is invented. This life is experience. It is a magnificent, fast-moving object of mind. Why of mind? Because mind's the only thing that can perceive it. It's just doing its thing. Energy expressing itself in uncountable ways. And if you've, after my talks, have looked into Roger Penrose's cyclical conformal cosmology, you'll see that the entire universe is constructed in that way. That there's a major inflation when things, moments, instantiations occur. They blast apart for who knows how long until they annihilate themselves into a moment where they reinstantiate. And I have to go run and turn off my phone. How annoying. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. Destructions is not whole when dharmas have not yet originated. Thus, nothing can be called a proximate condition. If it is destroyed, how can it be a condition? Since things devoid of intrinsic nature are not existent, this existing that comes to be can never hold. Finally, we're starting to get to the point here. This is what I've been saying. That product does not exist in the conditions, whether they are taken separately or together. What does not exist in the conditions, how can that come from the conditions? If that which does not exist in them is produced from those conditions, how is it that the product does not also come forth from non-conditions? In other words, why don't things just appear in and of themselves? And as he stated before, since things devoid of intrinsic nature are not extant, this existing that comes to be, this being moment to moment, can never hold. It can't be static. Right? This is what we keep saying. The 14th statement here, the product consists of the conditions, but the conditions do not consist of themselves. Because those conditions are only manifest when there is an act. Something acting upon them. In samsara, space-time is acting upon them. And they manifest according to space-time. It's a cyclical loop, isn't it? So, at this point, the question I would think you'd be asking yourself is, so what, Sylvain? What does all this have to do with my practice? And I don't fault you for asking that question. I asked that question. I would think it's a logical question. This kind of analysis occurs when a level of doubt becomes not only prevalent, but destructive. When doubts arise, we tend to formulate alternate opinions, alternate thoughts, alternate ways of doing, being. And that's when we start to raise whole groups of monkeys to justify doing things wrongly, inappropriately, unproductively. Remember, the goal here is to liberate ourselves from attachment so that we can experience this life fully. This life is a series of points. We perceive it thusly as a line, a lifetime. But we really have only this moment to experience the magnificence of this construct. In samsara, we have this opportunity to just gaze upon it and marvel. So, to let doubt creep in and start to construct a whole miasm of rituals and practices and belief systems and friends and organizations to share in our... That might be entertaining. Anybody ever played Dungeons and Dragons? There you go. You want to do that with your life and play that game, you can do that. That's not Buddhism, though. That's not liberation. That's an invitation to stress, anxiety, winning, losing, all of it. Just admire yourself in duality and experience the roller coaster that is samsara. But that, again, is not Buddhism. It's not what we're doing. It's not what we're trying to do. We can experience those games. We can have fun playing them without being attached to the actions of that game, to that being our very being. Let that be something else other than identifying I won, I'm this, I own, I possess, I work. Let that all exist, but watch it from a safe mental distance, the Buddha mind, and enjoy it. Because you don't die, you don't capture, you don't go to war. Games, they're all some kind of war. Why war? Because emotions, because objectives, because loss. There is nothing lost, there is nothing gained. It's just a game. How many times have you heard that? But when you're in the spirit of the game, boy, you're in samsara. So when you chant Namu Myoho Renge Kyo and you focus on your mandala, feel that release of all that game. Experience the simple, straightforward joy of Buddhahood, of Buddha mind, of experience. When it occurs, everything, all thingness in your life will take on a completely different hue, a completely different solidity. That's what Nagarjuna is trying to construct in the mind of samsara, so that you have a powerful, logical, reasoning way to consistently remind yourself, oh yeah, I don't need to be so invested in what is happening, this being. I can enjoy it for what it is, this play, this Instantiation. I don't need to make myself miserable. We know the words to it, we just don't listen to it. All right, that's it for today. I hope we're getting somewhere with this. I always worry about Nagarjuna because it's not for everyone. And if you're just listening to this and listening to me or reading this and you're going, man, I don't know if I like this, don't do it. You don't need to. We have a mandala of Gohamsan. We have a very simple, very straightforward way of experiencing what all of this is trying to dissect. You don't have to dissect it. Just enjoy your practice. It will happen naturally. All right? Thanks for being here, for listening. Thanks to my patrons. You guys are awesome. Please be strong in your practice. Myoho Renge Kyo, it couldn't be simpler. Be kind to yourself, your friends. Take care of your health, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.